All right, y'all, just a quick little note on the blurriness that you're about to see. I usually screw up in the statistics and the info cards once a week. Well, this week my screw up was that I left my lens on manual focus, so I'm going to be a bit blurry in some videos this week. Sorry, y'all. We'll do better next week. College football nerds, talking LSU, talking Georgia, SEC Championship 2019. It's championship week, y'all. Let's talk about it. Before we do, before Josh and I piss some of y'all off or make some of you really happy, I don't know. Want to remind y'all, obviously, we've talked about it the last couple of weeks, that we have an audio version of this show, and some of y'all don't want to use your data, want to listen to us on your commute, don't want to see my shining, smiling face, and that's okay. We are on Android, we are on the iTunes, and we'll link it in the description. It will be out today, not soon after the video version comes out. All right, Josh, we are going to discuss LSU and Georgia, and the feeling right now is that LSU is going to just wipe the mat with Georgia. You talked in our top 10 that Georgia's defense is so good, it might not give them an opportunity to get a lot of separation against some of the mediocre teams, but it also might not let an elite team get much separation from them, which I think is a fair point. So have we seen kind of the blueprint for how this game might go, given that, look, LSU's played one team this year with a defense that's even close to Georgia's. I think Georgia's is obviously better than Auburn's, but we're thinking blowout city, but the last time LSU played a defense like this at home, it was a 3-point game. So does that give us any, maybe not an indicator, but at least some hope, some inkling that Georgia may be a complete fourth quarter game in this one because we've already seen that happen once this year?
The worst thing about Georgia is that they've been unable to get a lot of separation from teams that are good or elite quality teams and win by substantial margins. But one, they still won those games. And two, they still kept them to low point totals. And I pointed out in our top 10, Georgia's not given up more than 20 points in a game. That's a very, very difficult thing to do. I think it speaks to how good Georgia is. And even when they gave up 20 points, that was the South Carolina game where one of the touchdowns was a pick six. Simply put, they just are not ever letting teams score very many points, and it's hard to get blown out when you do that. Now, the question is how much that translates to the LSU game. And I think that is a difficult question because of what LSU's done to other teams, including some really good defenses themselves. Everyone likes to cite the Auburn game for LSU and say that was 23-20. Now, that game had a lot of some fourth down conversion failures, other issues that kept LSU from scoring at a higher clip. But what is also true about that game is that it's kind of a singular data point. I think it's more interesting that LSU was generally able to score points in pretty much every other game, like the Florida game, which, Georgia and Florida played and close and it was low scoring. LSU had no problem getting to a higher score. They gave up more points. I get that. But like Texas A&M. Now, Texas A&M, through most of the season, wasn't giving up a ton of points. They'd given up 19 to Georgia the week prior. They gave up a ton to Alabama. They gave up some to Arkansas. They gave up about 28 to Auburn, 24 to Clemson. They had been a consistently good defense, except for the fact that LSU put up 50. So the question is LSU the 50-point team? Is LSU the 23-point team? How does that mean when you're looking at Georgia? I think it really all comes down to, like, if you're bend but don't break, if you have the ability to get disruption, and how well LSU is able to execute their offense the way they want to execute it. From what I've seen from LSU, a lot of it hinges on the ability of Joe Burrow to understand what's going on the opposing defense, to find the open man, and to make the smart decision with a solid, accurate throw. LSU has a lot of talent and power on the outside. I think Chase is quietly one of the best receivers in the country. Jefferson's a very good receiver. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is a great back for what they're trying to do right now. They've got Moss at tight end. It's just a well-balanced, good attack with a lot of different options with a guy in Brady that knows how to get the right matchup. And when you have Burrow making the right decision, everything clicks. What I think Georgia brings to the table is the ability to not give LSU the easy open man. What we really only saw in the Auburn game was an LSU team that didn't have always an option. Auburn would get everybody covered. There wouldn't be a clear throw. They would get pressure, and Burrow didn't really have some option to, complete the pass. Now, when LSU played Auburn, they were able to use RPOs to march down the field. It wasn't really until the field compressed and the safeties got involved that Auburn was able to stop it. Now, we talked about a lot. It wasn't really an aberration. I mean, I think LSU probably wins that game by more than just a touchdown. Most of the time, it's probably more like a 2-score game, but it was sort of an RPO compressed field concept. I think Georgia can do that, and they can do it better. They have been extremely sound defensively in every game. They're probably, if not the most well-coached team defensively in the SEC, they're close to it. I think it's been kind of interesting that Kirby Smart, he's made some good coaching hires, but just as a head coach, his defensive unit has been sound, well-coached defensively, and always solid, while Will Muschamp's at South Carolina has not been anywhere near as good on a consistent basis. But Georgia's also extremely deep and extremely talented. They can continue to roll out guys. They can continue to be disruptive. Basically do everything Auburn did, but I think do it better and with better athletes, not to get beaten by the RPO in the middle of the field. I do think there is a strong argument for the fact that Georgia is going to be able to hold LSU to less than 50 points, certainly last week, but also not anything dissimilar to what maybe that 23-point game against Auburn, probably better than Alabama did. It's an interesting point.
There's the flip side of this that Georgia fans are going to point to LSU giving up 38 to Ole Miss, 38 or 36 or whatever it was to Vanderbilt. And it seems like every time LSU starts getting heat nationally for their defense, they go out and really do a number on somebody defensively. And they did it to Texas A&M this last weekend. I do think there are some transitive property concerns here for me. I said that Georgia needed to go out and hammer A&M, show us that you can beat somebody. Georgia fans said it doesn't matter. 1-point win is the same as a 50-point win. I don't think that's true, but I also don't think there's this huge chasm between the two based on the 2 weeks that we saw in a row. But what concerns me is, let's say that LSU does have some holes on defense. Let's say that they are more the defense that gave up 38 to Ole Miss, and less the defense that held A&M to absolutely nothing this week. With Georgia already offensively being limited by wide receivers, with Kaiser being hurt and not playing in this game, with the suspension for a half to Pickens, who would be the next man up in terms of your explosive playmaker, and the question marks. I know he said he's okay, but the question marks surrounding Swift. Is this a situation where what's been to this point a mediocre offense is even worse and can't even exploit the issues that LSU has? Or does Georgia still have enough offensively in terms of skill set that they're going to be able to put up some points?
Not to rain on the parade, but I think it's a real concern. So I just explained why I think Georgia may hold LSU to, something less than maybe 40 points. But I think the real problem, if you're Georgia, which is exactly what you just said, Georgia already struggles offensively. And they're not going to have Kaiser in this game. Pickens threw a punch, so if I remember correctly, he's going to be ejected for the first half of this game. Swift may or may not be injured, but even if he's healthy, I don't think he's going to be 100%, which means you probably can't lean on him that heavily. Now, they got a great stable of backs, but it's still a problem because Swift is a first-round talent, and it's an offense that hasn't been super effective. So when you put that all together, I think it's a problem. Now, what's even worse, I think, though, we talked about this a lot. LSU took a step back in pass defense this year, but they took a step forward in run defense. They're bigger on their front. They're more athletic. They're relying on really guys like Shelvin and Ika that are big physical guys in the middle. It's kind of hurt their defense in some ways because they're not as disruptive. They've struggled getting a pass rush, but they've been able to stop fronts and hold point a lot better. When Lawrence and Logan have been healthy, they've been very effective. They've been able to start mixing things in with like Damone Clark to be more effective in the pass rush. I think the biggest thing that they've really done is sort of concede that they're not going to rush the passer well. They found some stuff in Clark, but really they're using Chason Moore as an outside linebacker, where I think he's been a lot more effective than he was a pass rusher. because he's very good in space and he's very reactive. And I think Georgia's going to find it difficult to do almost anything in this game. The combination of offensive injuries and an LSU defense that is really, I think, really improved. They were terrible in that Ole Miss game. Now, that could be a lot of things, sort of a hangover from big games. It had a lot to do with the way that Ole Miss was a running quarterback team. They didn't throw the ball a lot. I don't think Georgia's traditional offense is going to prove those same sort of problems for LSU's defense. And like I've said before, LSU's defense struggles when they get confused. They struggle with really good scheme. You can kind of spread them out, finesse them the way Alabama did or the way Ole Miss did. Georgia wants to line up and run the ball and hit you in the mouth, and I don't think that's a great way to beat LSU.
It's funny we haven't talked about this concept all year. We talked about it last year, but in the Ohio State-Wisconsin discussion that we just had, we mentioned the concept that we've touched on before where if you're outmanned a little bit, you have two paths to go. You can either go super conservative, hope you play mistake-free football, and try to super shorten the game, get it into the fourth quarter close with a chance to win, or you can play kind of balls to the wall, sort of throw the kitchen sink at them and hope that something sticks and you get in a rhythm and you can maybe win a shootout or maybe just, come out and win that. If you're going to win 2 out of 10 you play, then you can snag one of the two playing that way. And if you don't, if you're the team that needs to do that to win, and if you don't, you're just going to lose death by 1,000 cuts anyway. And that's usually what happens. In this case, where both of us thought Wisconsin needed to kind of open it up a lot more than they did in the first game against Ohio State, and that they were going to suffer the same fate if they went kind of conservative and play it close. In Georgia's case, is it safe to say that they don't need to open it up and they do need to try to lean on that defense more, shorten the game a whole lot, and try to have a close game in the fourth quarter where they can make something happen? Which of the two approaches do you think Georgia should take, given that I think we both feel like they're a little bit outmanned?
I think they need to keep it a close game. And the reason for that, I talked about taking aggressive chances. A lot of that was the assumption that your defense is outmatched by the opposing offense, that you're going to be out-athleted on the defensive side of the ball. Because if your defenders can't line up athletically, you're going to give up points. Georgia can man-to-man line up with LSU's offense, I think, athletically. This is one of 2, if not 3, defenses that can make that statement. Clemson and Ohio State probably could make that statement. Remains to be seen. Georgia's defense is exceptionally athletic and talented. This is, with Alabama, for the most talented roster really in college football. Again, Ohio State maybe has an argument. Clemson has an argument on the upper end, but Georgia's deeper than Clemson. And they can go toe-to-toe, and I think what's important is Georgia's won a lot of games close. They're used to winning 2014 over Auburn, 24-17 over Florida, 23-17 over Notre Dame. They know how to win that close game. And they've lost one against South Carolina. That took a lot of bad breaks for that to happen. But if you have the same sort of game you had against South Carolina, you take that if you're Georgia in this game. I think you want it to be low scoring. You want it to be ugly because you're used to playing ball control. And I think you kind of wonder how LSU is going to respond if they're in a ball control situation because they are a high scoring offense. And sometimes those high scoring offenses panic when they're in that kind of situation. You want to create turnover. You want them to force something. Maybe you get a positive break out of it and you end up winning the ball game. Winning the ball game because you're in a low-scoring game, because you know how to play that kind of football and be patient and wait for the game to come to you. And quite frankly, I think the biggest issue for Georgia, because of the receiver situation, especially in the first half, without Pickens, I don't know what you go to because Demetrius Robinson has not been good enough. I think, when you look at their receiving core, Blaylock has been productive at times. I don't think you're going to get a ton out of Simmons and Landers against a high-end, the talent level that LSU has in the secondary relative to everybody else Georgia's played. They haven't, they're better, and yet Georgia didn't have a lot of success against other teams. I think your best shot is if Pickens is back in the second half and you got a close game, then maybe you can get a couple plays. You just got to score 1 or 2 touchdowns, right? If it's a 20-point game. I say all the time that the hardest games to predict are games played between high-end teams below 25 points, because they tend to sort of hinge on one or two strange bounces. That's the kind of game you want to play for Georgia.
And on the flip side of the ball, I think that there is an opportunity if you play that shorten the game sort of approach. There is a real concern for me that LSU says, okay, we're going to shorten the game, but we're going to score a couple of times in a row, and you're going to be dug into a hole that you can't dig out of, and then you're forced to. It's one thing to have the element of surprise and be aggressive on your own terms. It's a whole different story when you have to be aggressive because you're down a couple of touchdowns halfway through the second quarter and you know what you've got offensively. So we could speculate a lot, and we're going to speculate a little bit more because we're going to give some picks here in a minute. But why don't you go ahead and give us sort of the backdrop of what the model says about this game and what the numbers are saying, and we'll go from there.
So everybody's familiar with our model by now. It's a model that is custom tailored to your team based on performance in the games you played, relative to your competition, relative to the way you play and respond to particular situations unique to sort of the fingerprint of your team. So our model in this particular game, it has LSU by a significant margin. Okay, so it thinks that LSU is going to pass the ball pretty well, not run it well. Georgia will run it some, not throw it well. LSU has a little bit of an edge. They score more points, 40-25. Unpacking it, Georgia has the better defense. This should surprise no one. 64% of opponent rush averages, 76% of opponent passing averages. Those numbers are obviously inherently opponent adjusted. LSU, 83% of opponent rush averages, 92% of opponent passing averages is a merely solidly good defense. I think they've played better than that. I will say at the end of the year, they've got gouged by some strange things. I think they just aren't always focused. But when they're focused, I think their talent level shows up and they can be quite good. So the score being 40-24, I think personally the problem with that is really on LSU side of the ball. Now, Georgia, 5.2 yards per attempt. Again, when they played Missouri, they had about 5.1 yards per attempt. It's not really off or inconsistent with Georgia's results. I think the issue is just that LSU is probably unlikely to score 40. And the model is kind of assuming that LSU gets theirs. And we've said a lot, and that Auburn game could have been more lopsided. So there is the argument that if they get that kind of yardage, they're still going to score 40 points. And we say all the time that an elite team puts up 40 points in a game. I just think Georgia is probably a good notch better than Auburn defensively. I think LSU may be stymied more by Georgia and by a more disruptive team that has a better secondary than Auburn has, in my opinion. Maybe not quite as dominating a front, but maybe a more disruptive front in their own way. And I think they may have some issues in this game. So personally, I don't think it gets up to the 40-24 number. I personally, and I'll go ahead and give my pick, I think the number is going to be about half that. So I would say as my personal pick, probably 21-10 is where I'd have this game. And, maybe I'm being more conservative here. And it may be that LSU lights them up. The way they lit up A&M, who is a solid defense. I just think, like a lot of spread attacks, there's this threshold point where LSU crosses a threshold and they go nuclear. And I think Georgia's going to keep them from that point. And I think it's going to be the same sort of frustrating game they had against Auburn, the same frustrating game we saw from Alabama against Clemson in the national title, where you've got this high-powered RPO-style offense, moves the ball some between the 20s, and I think they're going to stall a lot in the red zone, and I think they're going to have a lot of promising drives die out just because it's not going to be consistent enough against a good defense.
I do agree with you that Georgia has a better defense than Auburn. I think they're more talented. I think they're we saw Alabama with the backup quarterback put up gobs of points on Auburn this last weekend. I don't think that happens against Georgia. But I also think that LSU's offense is better than 21 points against anybody. I feel like they're going to get theirs regardless. And you did touch on it, and I think it's valid. You glossed over it, but I think it's valid. LSU had 23 points in that game, but they also were facing an Auburn they knew couldn't score. And they had a couple of weird issues like slipped footing on a 4th and 1 attempt that didn't translate the 500-plus yards to more than 23 points. They've been far more efficient in scoring this year, even on fewer yards. So I think they get theirs against this Georgia defense, but I think the Georgia offense is going to show up a little more than they have in some other games. Georgia put up a pretty easy 24 on Florida, and they got out early on Auburn and sort of took their foot off the gas with the 21. But I'm going to go 33-20 LSU over Georgia, and we're right in line about the same. We both have LSU covering the 6 they're getting. 6 is a lot of points for a championship game where we're talking about number 1/2 versus number 4. That's a lot of points. It's not, and I don't remember what it was last year. And Georgia came out and punched Alabama in the mouth in this game last year. They might be able to do it again against LSU, but I think that I think early it's going to be a little more uncomfortable for LSU than probably LSU fans want to see. I think LSU's getting a little cocky right now, especially with this A&M game. I think they're getting a little cocky. They're outwardly, the words they're saying from the teams and the fans and the coaches scares me a little bit. Getting into the season of teams and schedule where you're playing teams that can actually beat you, that gives me a little bit of concern. But right now, I think LSU's just a better team. I think their defense is better than they're being given credit for. And I think their offense is the best in the country right now. So 33-20. Tell me, we do this sometimes. Tell me, what does this score look like if Georgia comes away with the win instead of your 21-10 prediction?
If Georgia comes away with a win here, I think the score is probably going to look more like, I'll probably say something like 27-23. I think if Georgia's looking like they're going to score, LSU's going to be a little more aggressive. I don't think they get held to 21. I actually think the score goes up. I have a hard time seeing Georgia score more than 30 points. I just do. I mean, Georgia has not, we talked about this a lot when we were discussing Georgia games previously. Georgia's not hitting the 30 mark on solid teams. They haven't, their games of more than 30 points were, Murray State, Arkansas State, Georgia Tech, Tennessee, even Vanderbilt, they hit 30 and stopped. So I just don't see them scoring over 30. Georgia is going to have to hold LSU under 30 points, I think, to win this game. I'll go a step further, though. I'll tell you how I think Georgia could win this game. There is one real warning sign to me with LSU, and that came from the Alabama and the Ole Miss game. Those teams pushed around LSU on their front. And we hadn't seen that too much, but Alabama and Ole Miss were able to bully LSU on the ground. Now, Ole Miss can rely on that ground attack, and they had a running quarterback, which was a different wrinkle, but they could go run first. Alabama was really not comfortable in a run-first offense, with partly due to how they built the offense, partly due to their reliance on Tua. They weren't really comfortable relying on Harris, but when they put Najee Harris, put the game on his back and let it ride, they were able to kind of claw away in the second half, and then Ole Miss followed that blueprint. I can't say LSU's fixed that problem because Arkansas and A&M, they can't run the ball at all. Haven't at any point this season. They've been totally anemic. It's not shocking you shut them down. Everybody has. So I think there's the possibility that Georgia could get in this game and just lean on that LSU front. And like you talked about with the Alabama-Georgia game, kind of just punch them in the mouth and maybe kind of shock people a little bit how well they're able to run the ball. So I think if Georgia wins the game, the most likely thing that's happened is we're going to look back and it's going to look like the sort of the opposite maybe of the Georgia-Texas game from last year, where everybody assumes that one team's going to come in and win, and it's pretty obvious from the jump that one of these teams is coming out and being more physical, and that Georgia sort of jumps on them and pushes their way down the field. That's how Georgia, I think, would play the game out if they won.
And yeah, I could see it. Like, my concern, and this is what we've said. We said this in the offseason. Georgia had the best offensive line in the country. We expected them to be able to run at will, and Jake Fromm could do his Jake Fromm thing that he's done in other years, and it hasn't shown up. And I've seen Georgia fans say this multiple times. I've seen them say, we keep saying we have the best offensive line in the country. It's time for us to actually show a game where we actually do have the best offensive line in the country. And if they show up this time, it could turn this game a lot differently than we're expecting. My thing is, we've already played a full season schedule. And at this point, teams are who they are. And I just don't think that – I think Georgia is an elite defensive team. And their offense, until proven otherwise, is fairly mediocre, especially with all these guys banged up or out for a half. I just don't see it. All right, y'all. Want to remind you, give us your score prediction. That's your only homework for this week. Give us your score prediction for this game, and let us know if you think Georgia's going to find some offense with all of these guys that might be missing the first or half of the whole game. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.